And that's what happens is it's these implicit norms in organizations where, oh yeah, we have a paternity leave, but yeah, the implicit norm is don't take it if you want to appear committed. Oh yeah, you can leave at 5:30, but don't if you want to seem committed to others. And this is really unfortunate. And I think what happens for a lot of people, especially men, is that we become lonely and socially isolated. And we end up essentially working so much that we don't have the relationships at home or with our friends that we really desire to have. There's a research by this researcher, Antonella. She did research and she's from Italy, but she lived in the US and did research. I think it was around New Jersey or New York. And she had a whole team of people working on for like 20 years on this research stream called social convoys. So social convoys, like as you know, like a physical convoy would be like a set of vehicles that travels together. Well, social convoys is a set of close relationships that travel with you through life. And so this research on social convoys, what Antonella and her team has found is that the social convoys of women are much more robust and meaningful than they are for men. So men, for example, if a couple is divorced, the woman is always going to be in the social convoy of her children as adults. Whereas the man sometimes no. Looking at all these, like sort of how many friends does a person have, how large the social convoys, this is always much more robust for women. So why are these social convoys so important? There's another study where if you look at man and a woman 60 years old, and for each one, their spouse passes away, the chances of that woman living another year are much higher than that man living another year.
Have you ever wondered why some leaders thrive and others struggle, despite having similar technical skills, similar experiences, similar levels of seniority? What if the secret to effective leadership lies not in what you know, but in how you connect with others? Connection, empathy, emotional intelligence. In today's episode, we will explore this question and others with my guest, Tony Silard. He's a professor of leadership and organizational psychology at Luis Business School in Rome. So we'll be talking about the research into leadership, the practical realities. We'll talk about why and how leaders' success is rooted in those social, emotional abilities, as well as personal character. We'll also cover some of the big challenges and issues facing leadership today, like loneliness. Loneliness for leaders, loneliness in the workplace, loneliness for individuals. We'll even touch on some of the gender dynamics of the workplace too, and loads more beside. It's a really wide-ranging but also very detailed and specific conversation today. And Tony does a great job of walking us through the statistics and the studies and giving us the evidence behind some of these concepts. So whether you are an emerging leader, seasoned manager, or a new one, this conversation will equip you with some more tools, practical advice, ideas to lead with more integrity and impact. And if you are eager to deepen your own leadership journey, don't miss the chance to come and join my Integrity Leaders community, where you can connect with like-minded individuals who are there for people-first leadership. You can access valuable resources, courses, knowledge base. You can grow as a leader in a supportive, safe environment. Visit leadingwithintegrity.co.uk to start that journey today. And you can join for free as a leadership explorer, or if you're interested in accessing more of the premium features, there are also paid plans available. And without further ado, we shall welcome Anthony on the show.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Anthony, welcome to Leading with Integrity. It's lovely to have you on the show today.
David, I love your show. Thanks for having me on. It's an honor.
Oh, well, likewise. To kick us off then, tell us a bit about yourself, your career so far, what you do today, and why you do it.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Well, so I live about half an hour outside of Rome in Castelli Romani in Italy. And let's see, my wife is from Mexico. We have two kids. They're 12 and 9. And I'm originally from Washington, D.C. That's where I grew up. I really, my whole career has been dedicated to leadership. I mean, I'm 58 now. I know I don't look a day over 57, but it's true. and and so I've been a leadership educator, trainer, coach, professor, you name it. I'm now a professor of leadership and organizational psychology at Luis Business School in Rome, and I also run a nonprofit organization called the Center for Social Leadership. And I do, in addition to teaching leadership in Rome, I also teach pro bono leadership conferences every year. They're multi-day conferences for, on average, about 150 to 200 nonprofit leaders. And I do those in Africa and Latin America, also in Kenya, Mexico, in Rome, Amsterdam, and I bring in a lot of other professors and trainers to teach different aspects of leading organizations. So it's a real kind of like really high quality package of training. And we do that because uh, it's, in my mind, leadership's a very powerful mechanism, and it shouldn't just be used as a kind of rich get richer model, but also really for social change. Because you have all these leaders of social change organizations who, they didn't wake up one day and say, "Oh, I really want to be the director of a nonprofit or NGO." Instead, they wake up going, "I want to change the world, and here's what I want to do." So we help them learn leadership, management, and a lot of the other like fundraising, strategic planning, and so forth. And my area of research is emotion and leadership. Right now, along with Sarah Wright at University of Canterbury in New Zealand, we're the two leading researchers in the world on leadership and loneliness. We have a lot of articles out on that topic. A lot of interview and survey studies trying to understand what generates loneliness in organizations for leaders as well as for the people they lead. And let's see, I was in the Peace Corps in Kenya. So I was there, and then I started a organization in Kenya and another, and then also in Tanzania, Guatemala, Indonesia, Oakland, California, Washington D.C., teaching at-risk youth leadership and work readiness, entrepreneurship, and was doing that for many years. So really, I was a leadership coach and consultant for many years. I've done leadership development with lots of Fortune 500 companies like Disney, GE, Google, Toyota, Boeing, and Apple, and really with their senior leaders and mid-level managers that are trying to work on their leadership abilities. And then also with most of the world's largest nonprofits like Save the Children, CARE, World Wildlife Fund, also political leaders like mayors, G20 cabinet ministers. And so over the years, I've learned a lot about what works for leaders and what doesn't. And I think I love what I do because leadership is really about personal development and how leaders show up. One of my favorite studies was a longitudinal study of over 10,000 engineers. This was done at University of Chicago with participation from Stanford and Harvard, and they tracked these engineers to see which of these engineers were really successful over this 10 plus years, and which ones weren't so successful. And the ones who were successful, well, what were they doing that their success was attributed to? And so it was really interesting because technical expertise or their knowledge of engineering I always ask people, like, what percentage of their future success do you think was attributable to their know-how or their technical expertise? And it's only 14%. So, think about it. Let's suppose you're an aeronautical engineer. If you don't have really strong technical expertise and you make a mistake in the cockpit, the plane might crash. So it's pretty important for engineers to have that strong knowledge and of how engineering works, whether it's their civil engineer, electrical, whichever. And so the other 85+% of the success of these engineers was attributable to only two things. Number one, personal character. Number two, socio-emotional abilities. So really, what kind of person were they and how did they get along with their coworkers? Now, those two, for me, are very inextricably intertwined. So personal character is like what Stephen Covey would call private victory, and socio-emotional abilities are public victory. But they both come down to a similar phenomenon, a similar dynamic, which is, what kind of person are you and how do you relate to others? So if your character is about manipulating and lying and cheating and kind of misleading people, well, good luck developing relationships, right? That's probably not going to go so well. So these two really come together. And so what I really love about teaching leadership is that it's really about these soft skills. It's about character, refinement of character, and it's about how we interact with others, how we develop relationships with others, which I call the goal there is what I call CMSRs, compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships. That's I would say the number one responsibility of leaders is developing compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships with their followers or reports, and facilitating the development of those CMSRs between their followers, between their direct reports, so that essentially it's all about the facilitation of healthy relationship development.
That 85-15 split is interesting to me. I wonder if the same applies across multiple industries and specialisms, because I feel like something where there's like that safety component, it makes sense to me because that 15% has less impact on their success as leaders in the future, because it's the baseline. Like, you have to have it to exist in that industry, in that role, because safety is paramount in aeronautics, in aerospace, for example. But I wonder if there are like parallels to any industry where there is that, like, you've got to have a baseline of technical capability, whatever that looks like in your industry, in your company, without which you're never going to get taken seriously anyway. So the other things wouldn't happen either. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, okay, so that's a great question, David. And engineering is a very masculine industry. It really, or occupation rather. It's really a very masculine. It's very male. There's many more men that go into engineering than women. And if we were to look at, so I'm working on a book now on gender and leadership, and if we were to look at more feminine occupations where there are more women going in than men. So for example, if you look at early childhood development, education, psychology, counseling, you've got 85-90+% women there. I would say in those types of occupations, the percentage of the success of those going into those occupations is probably going to be quite a bit higher than 85% in terms of personal character and socio-emotional abilities. So an engineer, for example, who is maybe somewhat of an introvert and doesn't get on with everyone so well, but is really good at what they do, is really, so in terms of safety mechanisms, is really able to understand these, what they're sort of the materials, the objects that they're working with. Probably people make more allowances and say, well, okay, Joe, yeah, he's a little irascible sometimes, but in the end, he's a good guy and he really helps us. And so, so he squeaks by. But I think that's going to be much further and far between when you look at someone who's working, for example, in a psychology clinic with 10 other psychologists. And, if they don't get along with others, a lot of what of their actual work output is opaque compared to engineering. So they're just assuming that, well, if she or he is good with is interacts well with us, they're probably interacting well with their patient, which is not always the case. And
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I think you're right. And there's a couple of things that we're kind of crossing over here, like common themes that we hear a lot about. So like the accidental manager who's like that person promoted for their technical skill, even though they've got no leadership or management capability. And then this problem as well around like the toxic high performer who is tolerated almost no matter what they do or how badly they behave. And for some reason, I don't know if you've watched, did you watch that TV series House back in the day?
Oh, I think I did see a few episodes of it. Yeah.
So the whole premise of that show is like he's just a genuinely awful person. Like he's horrid to everyone, even his patients, but he's really good at the medicine and figuring out the puzzle. So they keep him around because he, in quotes, saved lives.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember that. And so, of course, I think what you're describing, a lot of people are going to connect with Steve Jobs, because he was, I don't think people called him a horrible person, but I think that he was known for humiliating people his employees, if he didn't like the work they were doing. I actually coached an engineer who worked for Steve for about 12 years at Apple. And he told me that after about 6 years at Apple, that Steve came into this kind of open space office where he was working. And you know how at Google and Apple and a lot of the other top tech companies, they give what they call innovation time off. It's like 1 day a week where their engineers can work on whatever they want to work on. And that actually has led to some of Google's top products like Gmail and Google Earth and so forth. Well, same at Apple. And so this guy I was coaching was working on this project he was really excited about. He'd been working on it for 6 months. So Steve comes into his kind of cubicle in this open space office, and in front of a few hundred people says, "This is crap. Stop working on it," and then walks away. So this guy was completely humiliated, and yet he stayed at Apple another 6 years. So I asked him, like, well, why did you stay there after that kind of public humiliation? And his response has always stayed with me. He said, Steve wasn't the best with relationships or emotional intelligence, but there's no one in the industry I could have learned more from than Steve. And I think this speaks to some really interesting research that's been done by one of my colleagues, Herben van Cleef at University of Amsterdam, where he found that different, let's say, followers, subordinates, direct reports, team members, whatever we want to call people that are being led by a leader, that different followers value the leader for different reasons. So some followers, and so if you look at the big 5 personality traits, one of them is agreeableness. So agreeableness is people who are high in agreeableness. They really value relationships, connection with others, harmony in the group. People high in agreeableness are looking for a leader where they feel that emotional connection with the leader. They feel this kind of emotional safety, psychological safety with the leader in that relationship. And what Van Cleef found is that that angry leaders actually sometimes work out okay when their followers are low in agreeableness. In other words, the emotional connection is not so important to them. I remember a guy who I was coaching once, and he said that trying to develop a relationship with someone is like what he called an emotional crowbar. Is like the other person he saw it as almost manipulative to try to develop a relationship with a coworker. Like that is not important. The important is focusing on the outputs. What are we working on? And most people would not agree with him. But this engineer I was coaching, for him, it wasn't about the emotional connection. So he would be considered low in agreeableness. For him, what was important was the cognitive learning pathway, that he really felt he was learning from Steve Jobs. And if that was the case, then he felt he was growing in his career. And okay, sometimes Steve would say things off the cuff that didn't need to be said, but he managed that. Other people I know who worked with Steve is the opposite. They didn't last long because they said, well, they just didn't like to be treated that way. So I'd say if you know one follower, you know one follower. They're all different. And one thing I encourage leaders to do, I would encourage your listeners to do, if you're in a leadership role, think about each follower, each team member like a file. Like you've got a folder on them, and this is what they like, this is what they don't like, this is what provokes happiness within them, this is what provokes suffering, and this is how they like to be worked with. You might also want to write down a few important personal facts about them, like if they have a spouse or a girlfriend or boyfriend, the name of that person. Same if they have a pet that's really dear to them, where they like to go on vacation. Because one thing that followers hate more than just about anything, and I hear this a lot when I'm doing interview studies with leaders and their team members, what they really hate is when they share some of their personal information with the leader in a conversation, and 2 weeks later they have another interaction in the hall and the leader's forgotten all of that. So they're like, why am I even sharing anything with you? And this is kind of puts a really unfortunate and somewhat undue pressure on leaders, because imagine you're leading 300 people and you have interactions with them every week or two, and sometimes much more. How are you going to keep all that information together? So every person is different, and for some people they need a lot of hand holding. Some people don't want the hand holding. It all depends, and each person is unique.
Yeah. The Steve Jobs one that always sticks in my brain is that I don't know if it was a conference or like a town hall, or anyway, the video did the rounds a couple of years back where one of his obviously quite angry engineers challenges him on his technical credentials. Have you seen this one? And his response is like a textbook example of how to respond to that. So he talks about, well, no, I don't, but it's not my role. My position here is for this, that, and the other, and the vision and leading. And I can't emulate it or repeat it off the cuff, but it was a pretty good answer. And I find it interesting. Like, I guess it's the nature of humanity, isn't it? We all have different aspects to our characters. Seeing that set against the stories you hear, because the ones you've just told aren't the first I've heard about how he was quite, let's say, difficult to work with, let's put it politely. And it is an interesting one. And then what you're saying there about the kind of the agreeableness and what you're looking for from your leader, I think the other aspect to that is it can change over time as well. And like early career stage people, for example, will probably put up with a lot more negativity or bad behavior from leaders because they're more likely to be, well, I don't know any better. I can learn from this person. I'll put up with it. And I think, at least for my personal experience, I certainly had that kind of change in my career where I got a bit further, a decade or so down the line, and suddenly that same behavior, because the leader hadn't changed, or at least not in that respect, was less tolerable to me. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that leaders need to kind of be aware of as well.
That's a wonderful point, David. And I think what you're speaking to is also about confidence. Like the more we've been in our role, the more confident we become, usually, not always. And like you said, the less we'll tolerate. There's a really interesting article, actually by two British professors, Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones. It's in Harvard Business Review. It's called Leading Clever People, and they actually have a book about it as well called Clever. And they make a really good point that you as a leader don't, like as you just mentioned, you don't have to know as much about every single domain of knowledge within your organization as the people you're leading. So, for example, a football coach not necessarily going to be able to score a goal as well as the star forward. The orchestra conductor probably cannot play the trombone better than the trombonist, but they have to lead these people. And I think that's where actually that's a really good story. I hadn't seen that video about Steve Jobs, and it's good to see that he knew how to be humble when he needed to. And
Yeah.
and I think humility is really important, and understanding that if we approach leadership with humility, and also with curiosity and wanting to learn from the people we're leading, then I think we create a much flatter organization where people do want to stick around longer. You know, it's interesting because there's also these studies about how people use technology, and in line with what you said about how we tolerate less the more, the longer we've been in our role. Well, it's also true that the people who sometimes are the most stressed out are those who are new to an organization, and they're the most tethered to their phones. They have the least work-life balance because they feel like, hey, I need to reply to every email and every text as quickly as possible. WhatsApp has become the new email in many organizations. So
Mm.
maybe it's they're tethered to their phones, checking those WhatsApps evenings and weekends because they want to really prove themselves. Whereas people who have risen in an organization and are higher status, often a little more relaxed about it. Like, well, okay, I can reply tomorrow morning, and I'm not going to feel like it's Armageddon because people no longer see me as the go-to person. Um,
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with how safe you feel as well, isn't it? I think when you're new to an organization, you're like you're still always going to have that sort of nagging feeling for a long time about, if I don't do this, they might see through me, get rid of me. They might not be happy with my performance. I better do as much as I possibly can. Whereas once you've been around a little while, that naturally goes away, doesn't it? The longer you're there without getting the sack, the safer you feel. And so it's easier to set boundaries, I think, at that stage.
I think you're right. I think you're right, David. And I also think that gender plays a role here. From the research I've been doing, men. Okay, so when I say this, I'm not speaking for all male leaders, or I'm not speaking for all female leaders. I'm saying if you look at large national and international samples, you're going to see these differences in the averages of what men respond to in organizations, what women respond to, and some of the differences. But it doesn't say anything about you or me or any particular listener listening here. Every individual is unique, and many people flout the findings of these kinds of studies. But if you look in general, you'll find that uh, that women tend to, when women are approaching social interaction, it's much more generally, and again, not for every woman, it's about intimacy. It's about a close one-on-one connection. Versus for men, it's often more about sociality. Sociality, like how do they fit into the social group? What is their status in that group? What is their role? Are they respected in that group? And that's more what men look for in socialization than what women look for. And so I think you get that especially for men in the beginning. You can, I've interviewed a lot of these guys. Before my most recent book, Love and Suffering, the book before that was called Screened In, The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age. And in Screened In, I interviewed many people about this issue, and I remember one of my interviewees, this guy, he was saying that he'd only been in an organization for a couple of years, and he was that guy who like wanted so bad to be the go-to person, and was just working day and night, and tethered to his phone all the time. And I think there's that insecurity because he really desired to fit into this social group and to have an esteemed role in that group. And I think that's what a lot of men aim for. And it's interesting because, there's with women leaders. So, there's been the whole like Sheryl Sandberg, like lean in movement, and that, women should assume leadership roles and really lean into the norms of work. Well, what I've observed in all of my studies and interviews is that it's actually the opposite has happened. Women are leaning out more. They're like, you know what? These norms in organizations are so male dominant, where guys are willing to work these extreme hours, and really devaluing themselves and their families. And that just doesn't work for most women. And there's a recent study, it's interesting, finding that women women tend to leave organizations because they feel lonely in the organization. And why do they feel lonely? Because they feel inauthentic. They feel like the norms of the organization are not their norms. And I think a part of that is that sociality versus intimacy distinction, that organizations are valuing people often for really putting in, pedal to the metal, extra hours, and rising to a high status role that way. Whereas people who are really developing close relationships with others, but not necessarily wanting to work these 80, 100-hour weeks, are not as valued. For example, if a couple becomes pregnant, well, that woman's there's essentially an earnings penalty for women where they tend to get passed over for raises. They tend to earn less because she's going to be busy. She's going to be caring after her child. Whereas for the man, ironically, there's an earnings premium because it's like, okay, now he's a little more settled. He's going to stick around more. We can count on him more. He's less of this sort of itinerant wayfarer. So yeah, all these gender dynamics come into play. Also, it's very interesting how they kind of operationalize in organizations.
Yeah, that. I mean, I don't know. It feels like quite a sexist narrative, that, doesn't it? Around particularly that pay disparity and suddenly the fact that the man is a parent now suddenly he's like more trustworthy in the eyes of employers. More, I guess a lot of it comes down to, maybe I'm cynical, he's less likely to take the risk of moving job now because he's got more mouths to feed, in inverted commas, in their minds. I do think it's interesting though, and that whole sort of lean in versus lean out piece. And you said, for women that's less acceptable, and they're more likely it doesn't work for them to do these ridiculous hours. Like, from my perspective, it doesn't work for anyone. I think it's just like culturally in the workplace, it's more acceptable, it's more expected that men will do that.
That's exactly right. Exactly right, David. And what's interesting is that we do it ourselves. It's not just, I mean, it's okay, we do it ourselves, but it's also about societal expectations. So in one study I'm working on, you have men who will not take paternity leave because it's not socially acceptable among the guys they're working with to do that. Whereas that's much less an issue for women, of course. One of the studies I really like on this is a study done by two Harvard economists. And what they did was they studied the drivers of the MBTA in Boston. So the MBTA, it's like, I don't want to get this wrong, it's something like Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority. I used to live in Boston, I should know. But we just called it the T. But it's essentially the trams, the trains, the buses, and so forth in Boston, in the greater Boston area. And what they found was that if a couple did not have children, they did a longitudinal study, and they found that, like, they're basically looking at the pay gap between men and women, and the male and female drivers of all their conveyances. And what they found was that if the couple did not have children, there was zero pay difference over time. There was no pay gap at all. But if they had children, then the pay gap started to widen and widen further and further. So what happened was, when a couple had a child, the woman would now start to work less, because now here's where the societal expectations come in, because she felt compelled to take on more housework, more childcare. There's the invisible cognitive load, which all of the unnoticed, unappreciated activities and responsibilities that women predominantly women have to engage in, or choose to engage in it sometimes, but often because they feel compelled to engage in because the man's not doing them, like, you know, setting up doctor's appointments, um, going to pick up children from sports practices and setting up play dates, making sure that lunches are packed. The list goes on and on and on and on. And a recent study found that even though women do more than double what men do, it's like 79% versus 30 versus I think 37%. What the sort of invisible cognitive load that women take on, all of these kind of immeasurable activities regarding children versus what men do, that men actually believe that they're doing just as much as women. It's this real miscalibration of kind of understanding and judgment around actually how much of the housework and childcare women are taking on versus men. In fact, there was a Pew Research Center study where they looked at time use data, and they looked at how are couples spending their time. And what they found was, if you take a fully employed woman and an unemployed man, that man is doing, believe it or not, 6 hours more of housework and childcare than his wife is. So she's out in the office all day, or working from home all day in her home office, but she's working all day long. He's unemployed. He's at home. He's doing 6 hours more a week of housework and childcare. Now, if you switch roles, now you have a fully employed man and an unemployed wife. That woman is doing 46 hours more per week of housework and childcare. We're talking about a 750% difference. So we're still in the dark ages of gender inequality around this stuff. And going back to the MBTA and the study at the Harvard study, so they found that because of all of this sort of unseen, additional, visible and invisible cognitive load that women are taking on, housework, childcare, and all the invisible responsibilities that we don't really acknowledge, that women, in order to do all of those things with a family, they have to work less. So they're working less over time, and as a result, their salary starts to decrease. Well, men, on the other hand, what the drivers of the trams and the trains and buses, what happened with the men is that as soon as they had a child, what did they do? They started working more hours. They started working overtime, and their salary started to increase. So the way I see it is that for men, we have 4 priorities. Almost all men, this is what we primarily focus on. 4 priorities: to procreate, produce, provide, and protect. That's what men tend to focus on. And not all men, but most men. And so the outcome of that is that men are working more. The salary gap is really widening for a couple if they have children. Now, what was really interesting, and then I'll end on this, is there was another study of lesbian couples, and they wanted to see, well, what happens is there any pay gap with lesbian couples? And similar result. If they didn't have children, there was no pay gap. But if they had children, whose pay started to decrease and whose pay started to increase? The birth mother started to her salary started to decrease. Her partner's salary started to increase. The only way they found to sort of equalize that with the lesbian couples was when they alternated being the birth mother when they had children, and then the salaries stayed the same. So, interesting stuff. And when we're thinking about leadership, all of this comes into play. Again, going back to Herman von Cleef's research, we have to understand that every team member is different, not just based on whether they want to connect with us emotionally or cognitively, but also their gender and also other demographic markers that, like they're going, from their ethnicity, their culture, their sexual orientation, their tenure, how, like you mentioned, David, how long have they been in the organization? all of that really affects what the direct reports of leaders are looking for in how those leaders are leading them.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some structural issues. There's some like practical realities as well. So, if removing any other structural or like social frameworks around this, the way most workplaces equate value and salary is in years of experience, isn't it? It's, the more years of experience you have, the more you're worth in terms of the salary a business will offer you on the whole. As always, there's exceptions. So best will in the world, if somebody, whichever parent it happens to be, has to take some time away from work for the birth or younger years of a child, the practical reality and the way the reward system is set up in the workplace now is they're losing a step. So of course there's going to be a disparity. Now I'm sure the disparity is much greater than can be explained by that small example. So there's definitely other factors at play. But I do think there is a conversation that should be had around how do we recognize value in terms of more than people's time. It's about their expertise, the outputs they deliver, and less about how much time they spend at their desk, whether they're at a desk, how many years they've been doing it, to me, is less important than how good they are at something. Because again, there's something that stuck with me from one of the earliest interviews I did on this podcast, actually, was a former guest talking about experience being a bit of a red herring, I guess, because just because you've done something for 10 years doesn't mean you've got better at it. You might have done it wrong in year one and then kept doing it wrong for the next 9 years.
That's
so it
right.
doesn't necessarily equate to value. So I think there's a whole conversation there as well that I don't think enough businesses are having, enough leaders are thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people mistake consistency with ability. It's better to be inconsistent than consistently wrong. And that's the thing.
True.
As we grow in an organization, we make a choice. Most people go through life, leaders grow through life. It's that being dedicated to continual growth. And I think though also we need to also acknowledge the role of culture. So for example, I'm originally from US, and there's a real, US has one of the lowest amounts of vacation leave of any industrialized country. And you compare, for example, with Netherlands. I had a one guy I coached recently, and he worked in Italy. He's Italian, so he worked in Italy, and then he went over and worked in Netherlands at Philips and a number of other companies. And he told me that it was just, the culture shock was unbelievable. Like in Italy, essentially people working very long hours, mostly guys. Italy has the lowest workforce participation of women in the EU. And then he went to the Netherlands, and so he was accustomed to working late. And he actually had his supervisor come into his office and say, and say, hey, it's 5:00. You need to go home. Like you need to go home and develop some hobbies, spend some time with friends, because you're going to actually be more productive that way. We don't like people working after 5 years. Imagine that's
amazing.
like I don't know if that's ever happened in the history of the United States. I mean, of course it has, but the norms are very different, and I think that's also going to affect. It's not just that if someone has to leave work more often because of family, that means they're devalued. That means that they'll earn less. That means because it's not just earning less. Let's face it, earning less also means less status, means less potential and for growth in the company or organization. And I think that going back to that study about women and loneliness in organizations, I think a lot of women are feeling lonely and are leaning out and ending and leaving because they don't feel that that the norms of those organizations and companies are really encompassing both their career and their family. And when these policies are not friendly toward families, a lot of guys are like, well, okay, I'm just gonna, this is the expectation. I'm gonna work and I'm gonna show everybody, I'm gonna prove myself. Whereas women are not willing to make those sacrifices of their children. And so it's interesting. There's a study by Carl Pillemer at Cornell University where he interviews people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and also centenarians, and he asks them, well, what do you regret from your life? Like, is there anything that you wish you'd done differently that we could learn from you? And what's interesting is that many of the men, what they share is they wish they'd spent more time with their families. And I think, so like you said, it's not just unfair to women, it's unfair to men. They're feeling disconnected from their families and of course their friends and then themselves. And for women, the women in Pillemer's study, what do you regret about your life? Well, you know what most of them shared, and this really is consistent with the study I just mentioned. They share that they wish they'd been more authentic about acknowledging their own needs and protecting their own needs. So it's like women being sort of feeling forced into this kind of involuntary caretaker role without much support and doing that for decades and then feeling like, what happened to me? And then men feeling like, compelled to be in those 4 PRs, right? Procreate, produce, provide, protect, and just focusing on that. And then also what happened to me? So on all sides, it's time for a reset.
Yeah, I agree. Your 5 p.m. in the Netherlands story sparked a memory in me from my early 20s, one of my first jobs. And it was very much the opposite conversation. But thinking back to like why these things, like these social expectations get set, and I think a lot of the time it's just repetition because that's what it was like for us when we had our first job sort of thing, when we don't know of any better way. I think there are also a few people who are doing it deliberately to kind of leverage the most bang for their buck or whatever in terms of business owners. And this, it was one of my first jobs, I think, at university. It was a small office attached to a bigger office. In the big office, it was like 80-90% women worked in there. It was technically a separate company, but there was one guy in there who was middle management, let's call him. And then my boss was in the small office with me. He was also the boss of the next door office. And I just remember overhearing this conversation. It was about 5:45 in the evening. That bloke had gone home at 5:30. It was just this conversation with the boss complaining about him, just saying, he's quite good at what he does, but, he's every day he's out on 5:30 p.m. on the dot, he's gone. And, I just don't feel he's committed. And that really stuck with me. That became the expectation for like the next 10 years of my career. I was like, I don't want the bosses saying things like that about me when I've left early. And I worked ridiculous hours as a result. Maybe cynically, that's why he had that conversation knowing I could overhear it. But, in hindsight.
Well, that's what happens is it's these implicit norms in organizations where, we have a paternity leave, but the implicit norm is don't take it if you want to appear committed. You can leave at 5:30, but don't if you want to seem committed to others. And this is really unfortunate. And I think what happens for a lot of people, especially men, is that we become lonely and socially isolated. And we end up essentially working so much that we don't have the relationships at home or with our friends that we really desire to have. So there's a research by this researcher, Antonella. She did research and she's from Italy, but she lived in the US and did research. I think it was around New Jersey or New York. And she had a whole team of people working on for like 20 years on this research stream called social convoys. So social convoys, like as you know, like a physical convoy would be like a set of vehicles that travels together. Well, social convoys is a set of close relationships that travel with you through life. And so this research on social convoys, what Antonella and her team has found is that the social convoys of women are much more robust and meaningful than they are for men. So men, for example, if a couple is divorced, the woman is always going to be in the social convoy of her children as adults, whereas the man sometimes no. They're looking at all these, like, sort of how many friends does a person have, how large the social convoys. This is always much more robust for women. So why are these social convoys so important? Well, if there's another study where if you look at man and a woman 60 years old, and for each one their spouse passes away, the chances of that woman living another year are much higher than that man living another year. Because what happens with because men have been working their whole lives, again, procreate, that's done. The 4 Prs, to procreate's done, and now it's produce at work and provide and protect at home, right? But where in there is connection, commiseration, collaboration, cooperation. So there's a lot missing there. So I think what you see is that you take this woman at 60 years old whose husband passes away, and she's like, okay, this is tragic. She's devastated. What am I going to do? Girlfriends, let's go out, right? Let's get together. I need to talk about this. I need support. Men, 60 years old, wife passes away. What's he going to do? Okay, well, wait, where are my friends? You see, a lot of men don't have friends. They have their wife's friends' husbands. And that's something different. And the way guys, there's an SNL skit. It's hilarious about the what's called a man park, where these women are taking their men to this park so they can play with each other, right? But that's how guys, how we're often talked to when it comes to socialization by our wives. It's like, oh, John, my wife's husband, Fred, he also loves barbecuing hamburgers. And it's like, okay, it's like, and guys don't know, is this more insulting or just depressing that they have so few friendships? But really, if you look at the psychological research on happiness, one of the only things all of these researchers agree on is that close relationships are the most important predictor of long-term well-being. So for example, the Grant study, the longest longitudinal study that we know of in history of adult development at Harvard, they found that this was all men actually in their study, because they started in like 1918, and it was all guys. They got from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and they actually ended a few U.S. presidents were in the group out of their like 800 men, as well as a lot of other luminaries and interesting people, and they tracked them and into many of them into their 80s, 90s, and so forth, and they found that the men who were the happiest in their older age were those who had really close relationships in middle age. So other studies have replicated this. Wherever you look on the lifespan, it's really the quality of those close relationships that leads to the most flourishing life later. And we've already talked about that's happiness. In terms of success, we talked earlier today, David, about in this session about how the strongest indicator for success for people, that engineer study, again, it's close relationships, the socio-emotional abilities. So I think I would say to each of your listeners, whether you're woman or man, boy or girl, whichever, there's no greater investment you can make for your long-term success and well-being as a leader and as a person than to invest in your social relationships. That's the number one thing you can do.
Yeah. Plus, it's nice not to feel so lonely as well. So, in the short term, there's a gain there as well, isn't there?
Well, and then the research on loneliness has found that loneliness dysregulates. When we're lonely, we don't make as good decisions. I mean, loneliness will actually derail your career. I had an example of this recently where a young CEO. This was actually a guy that was interviewed by Brene Brown. This young CEO, he just thought, okay, I really love what you're sharing, Brene, about vulnerability, and I'm just going to go and I'm going to tell all of these investors in the first round of funding of our company that the truth. You know what? I'm in over my head. I just don't have no idea what I'm doing. And she's like, whoa, wait. You don't want to do that. That's not the kind of vulnerability where, that's what happens is that when we're lonely, and many CEOs, many senior leaders are lonely because who can they talk to? You can't talk to the board. You talk to the board, it's like, well, do we have the right CEO? If you talk to your employees, it's like, okay, you're leading us and you're, and you don't know what you're doing. So many leaders find themselves, they have these huge decisions they've got to make, and they've got no one they can talk to. And that is one of the main drivers of loneliness at the executive level.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there around, again, back to sort of I don't know if it's societal expectations, but like the workplace expectations, the misunderstandings, myths about what leaders are, what they look like, what they do, how they behave, and this problem around the perception that leading means knowing the answer, making the decisions. And I think that leads so many of us down that path of keeping the decisions to ourselves, to not discussing things, assuming you can find the right room, the right people to talk about it without risking the whole business. So not the investors.
Right.
But you almost become like, it's self-isolating, isn't it? Because you see that as your role. You think that's what people expect of you as a leader. And so it becomes almost self-fulfilling as well. And then you get stuck in that vicious cycle of loneliness.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. And I have a leadership principle I teach in my conferences, David, which is it's easier to be a friendly leader than to be a friend and a leader.
Mm.
And so this is the thing is that where you work, it's kind of like you don't want to, fish and swim off the same pier. Like where you work is not the best place for most leaders to develop genuine friendships, because there's this disparity. Like you control other people's livelihood. They don't want to hang out with you on a Saturday night and let their hair down because of what's called evaluation apprehension. They fear you're going to evaluate them, assess them by what they do. So what I recommend to leaders is to find peer groups. That seems to be the best, most replicable solution for loneliness around at the executive level, or especially around wanting like closer connections. And so find other leaders from other industries that you can meet with. Maybe you have like a lunch once a month and get together, and people can share ideas with each other, listen to each other. And it's a place where, you agree, like, okay, just like whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, whatever happens at our lunch, whatever we talk about, it's confidential. We keep it here. And then some of those people can end up becoming really good friends if you really commit to it.
One thing as a solopreneur, particularly starting as I did before COVID, so loneliness was a bit of a problem once or twice over the years. But what got me out of it is exactly that. It's networking. So I know at least once a month I go to an online networking thing. It's pretty much everyone in the room is a solopreneur, single, loner business owner, just like me. And we've built some great friendships over the years as well. So I can attest to the practicality, but also the fact that it works.
And that's very wise that you do that, David. It's really one of the most important things you can, most important investments of your time, because also you get ideas from others, and you look at what you're doing. It's kind of like you're stepping off stage and onto the balcony with them to look at what you're doing and what they're doing. And so it's an excellent idea. And I think it also is important, not just for men, but also for women, for friendships to form. Sometimes we need some pretext to initiate our interaction. So I call it thematic friendship. That you need to have a theme in the beginning. Sometimes it's kind of like you ever walk down the street and you see like a really small tree, and you see how it's like tied to a stick, right? Or so
Yeah.
that stick is kind of like the theme of a budding friendship. Like you have some theme that it gives you something to connect about, and then over time you transcend that theme and you go on to and the friendship becomes much more profound.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I like that. That's a good way of thinking about it. So, I'm slightly conscious of time. Um, we've touched on loads of really big issues, and I feel like there's more that we haven't got to. So, you're going to have to come back sometime, and we'll pick up on a couple of the
Well,
others.
well, you're such a fantastic host, so you're not going to have to twist
Oh,
my
well, thank
arm
you.
to
Oh,
to
good.
to
Pleased
to,
to hear it.
to bring me
Yeah.
back. And yeah, can I for this time can I offer 2 free books to your listeners, David? Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure. I do have one more question that I'd
Oh
like
yeah,
to
please,
ask you
please
as
go ahead.
well. But yeah, after that, definitely. So this is the mandatory one that everyone has to answer because it's my favorite question. So
Okay.
it's leadership heroes.
Leadership heroes.
And the question is, if you could pick one person, but it could be anyone you can think of, so they could be alive or dead, past or present, real or even fictitious, but it's got to be someone who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that be for you and why?
Okay, so I'll offer a caveat that I don't think any individual I've ever known or read about perfectly embodies leadership. I think
That's fair.
the ideal is always above the real, unfortunately, or fortunately. So, but I would say a person who has very significantly influenced me as a leader is Malcolm X. And let me explain why. So one of the leadership principles I teach is I call it lead 365 days a year, not one day 365 times. And I think what Malcolm X did, which was truly amazing, is that he didn't finish the way he started. He was people called him mercurial because he was able to adapt, able to change. He became the most, after essentially he was a foster child. He ended up in Harlem in New York, becoming like a essentially like a drug dealer and thief. And then he rose from that to become the most prominent minister of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam had this, essentially this was it was very much about, reaction to a lot of the race politics at the time. And for them, it was African Americans versus what they called white devils. And they had this idea that like essentially for that white people couldn't be involved in their struggle for more equality. And so what Malcolm did, and I think is part of the reason that it resonates so much with me, is that he left that whole sort of micro environment in the United States of race politics, and he decided to go and travel to Africa and the Middle East and go meet with other leaders from other countries, and he had this really kind of like memorable encounter. I think it may have been the Algerian ambassador. It was a leader in Algeria, and the Algerian leader said to him, "So from what I understand, like you're not unwilling to work with white people, but I'm considered Caucasian. So does that mean we can't work together?" And that really like put him into like a place with a lot of reflection. And that and other meetings, he came back to the US and he decided that, okay, up to this time, I've had people coming up to me who were European Americans saying, can I help you? Can I get involved? And he always would say, no, I'm sorry, and move on. And he came back and said, well, he ended up leaving the Nation of Islam. he formed a new organization called the Organization of African American Unity. And he decided that what current civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., were doing, where they were taking essentially the issue of oppression of African Americans, they were framing it as a civil rights issue and taking it to the US government. Well, Malcolm said, no, I want to, with the Organization of African American Unity, we believe this is a human rights issue. And we want to take it to the United Nations beyond the United States, because this is also affecting our African and African diaspora brothers and sisters in the UK, in all around Europe, in Africa, in the Caribbean, around the world. And so that always stuck with me, because I think sometimes our greatest enemy as a leader is looking back at us in the mirror. It's like you said, right? It's like you said earlier. It's like there's that saying, you keep doing what you've been doing, you'll keep getting what you've been getting. And I think leaders, especially today, need to be able to adapt, need to be able to change, and understand that as a leader, all eyes are on you. And when you demonstrate that you're open to change, then that sets the tone for the whole organization. I think it's Emerson who wrote that an organization is an elongated shadow of a single person. So I think as leaders, we have to be very sensitive to what are the implicit norms that we are projecting across the organization. Are they equitable across gender, across culture, across many different markers, demographic markers of human beings, which really don't always tell you that much about the human. Each human being is unique and different. So anyway, that's a little bit of a long response, but that's I would say Malcolm X has inspired me more than any other leader.
Yeah, so I think he's been chosen before, but I love the reasoning behind it. Such a great explanation there as well. So thank you for sharing that. Didn't know all of the history there either, so thank you.
No, and thanks again for having me on your show. It's really been one of the best podcasts I've ever joined. I really enjoyed it a lot, and thanks to your not just your questions, but also your like authentic reflections about your own career and your own leadership journey. So thank you, David, for that. And so for your listeners, if it's okay, I'd like to offer you 2 free books. One is called The Myth of Happiness: How Your Definition of Happiness Creates Your Unhappiness. And the second is called The Myth of Friendship: How Your Misunderstandings About Friendship Keep You Lonely. Like my book, which is on Amazon and wherever books are sold, which is called Love and Suffering: Break the Emotional Chains That Prevent You from Experiencing Love. These two, The Myth of Happiness, The Myth of Friendship, it's all in there. Stories, easy to understand psychological studies that relate to these themes. And anyway, how do you get them? It's very easy. You go to theartoflivingfree.org. Again, it's theartoflivingfree.org/free happiness and friendship books. So again, theartoflivingfree.org/free happiness and friendship books. Put in your email there. You're going to receive a confirmation email. You confirm it, and then you get the download links. And at that point, you've joined my author community, and you will receive every couple weeks a new article on leadership or loneliness, relationships, work-life balance. And you can keep and stay in there, or you can just enjoy the books and unsubscribe, whichever you like. Of course, I hope you'll stay, but either way, I hope you enjoy the books. And anyway, once again, David, I really thank you for inviting me. This has been great today.
It's been a really good conversation. I've enjoyed it as well. And I'll pop that link in the show notes so everyone can find it easily. And thank you so much for your time and for your conversation today, Anthony. Have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too, David. Thank you.
Tony, thank you so much for joining us today and for taking us on an enlightening journey of the research, the data, and the real world experiences and stories there that you shared. Some great stuff there. I hope, listener or viewer, that his insights on leadership and personal development have inspired you to reflect on your own leadership and how you might improve it, where some of the gaps are, also what you're doing right and what you're doing well, because that is always worth reflecting on too. Don't forget to check out those show notes below for the links to Tony's book, website, LinkedIn, etc., as well as visiting leadingwithintegrity.co.uk to learn more about the work that I do, and perhaps come and join us at the Integrity Leaders online community for new leaders, first-time founders, people who are new to or struggling with leadership. And all that remains for me to say is thank you so much for being with us today. Do join me again next week when I'm talking with my next guest, Bill Derrick, about navigating the storms of career and life. And until then, as always, be a leader, not a boss.